Hey guys, tonight we are going to slip quietly into the candlelit corridors and echoing great halls of a medieval court, where the air smells faintly of beeswax, roasted meats, and the perfume of too many people trying just a little too hard. You're not just a visitor tonight, you're the new queen, freshly arrived in a foreign land after days of slow travel and a rattling carriage, your trunk stuffed with silks, your mind stuffed with advice from people you will never see again. The courtyard is already buzzing. Courtiers in jewel-toned tunics glance your way in carefully measured doses. Too much interest might be read as ambition, too little as insult. Somewhere to your left, a pair of kitchen boys pause in carrying a barrel just long enough to stare openly. In the background, your escort is murmuring introductions, half of which you can't hear over the clatter of hooves on cobblestones. You probably won't survive this if you treat it like a fairy tale wedding. Marrying into royalty is more like moving into a very large, very well-decorated chessboard, where all the other pieces already know each other's moves. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And, as always, tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from, and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The palace gates swing open and you're met by a blast of warm air, roasting meats and rushes newly strewn on the flagstones. A herald in a red and gold surcoat calls out your name in a voice that bounces off the courtyard walls. A little too loudly, perhaps, but volume is a kind of status here. Mainstream fact: in many medieval courts, formal arrivals of royal brides were staged events, with specific protocols for where the bride would dismount, who would greet her first, and how many steps she would take before speaking. Quirky tidbit: some queens brought their own straw or rushes from home for their ceremonial walk, believing they carried luck or protection from unfriendly spirits in the new court. Historians still argue whether the elaborate arrival process was primarily to honor the bride or to impress foreign envoys with the host court's wealth and order. It might have been both. You're guided toward the great hall, past carved stone pillars and along a tapestry-lined passageway. Every step feels like stepping deeper into someone else's story. The tapestries are busy with hunting scenes, stags, hounds, and improbably cheerful hunters. But you can feel eyes on you from behind the woven trees. A lady-in-waiting whose name you instantly forget leans in just enough to whisper. They're judging the embroidery on your gown. You glance down at the gold thread and think about the woman in your old home who spent 3 months stitching it. The king, your new husband, stands at the far end of the hall, beside a long table piled with goblets and fruit. He smiles, but it's the kind of smile that could belong equally to a friend, a stranger, or someone about to negotiate a treaty. The first toast is for your health, though the man delivering it spends more time praising the width of the grain harvest. You raise your goblet, smile in all the right places, and try not to spill on the imported carpet beneath your feet. And somewhere, above the music, you hear the faint hiss of whispering begin. Not malicious, yet, but testing, like the first drops before rain. The music from the minstrels seeps into the corners of the great hall, soft enough that you can hear the uneven rhythm of boots on the rushes as courtiers drift between groups. It's a kind of silent choreography. You see pairs form and dissolve in an endless cycle, always exchanging a word or a glance before splitting apart again. Somewhere in those quiet exchanges, your future is being decided in ways you won't know until months later. Mainstream fact: in medieval Europe, marriage alliances among royalty were deliberate political tools. A union between a queen and a foreign king could secure a peace treaty, settle trade disputes, or bolster claims to contested lands. Quirky tidbit: Some courts had a custom of assigning symbolic animals to new queens in the gossip of the palace. A swan might mean elegance, a fox cunning, and unluckily, a hen could suggest someone who clucks but doesn't act. No one ever told the queens which animal they'd been assigned, but the choice was whispered often enough that the rest of the court understood the code. Historians still argue whether these animal symbols were harmless nicknames or part of a subtle network of informal ranking that shaped influence behind the throne. At your table, an older noblewoman, her veil stiff with embroidery, leans toward you with a question about the harvest in your homeland. Her tone is syrupy, but the way she glances sideways at the king suggests she's measuring your answer for something beyond agriculture. You speak carefully, mentioning a good yield of barley, and she nods, though her eyes say, "Noted." A servant glides past with a tray of sugared almonds, and you take one, mostly for the excuse to look away. The sweetness hits your tongue, but the shell crunches with a satisfying firmness, a small island of certainty in a sea of ambiguity. Joke 1. You imagine carrying a pouch of these almonds into every political conversation, just so you have a reason to pause before answering anything. Across the hall, two young squires pass close enough for you to hear them muttering about the dowry you brought. You resist the urge to turn your head. Instead, you study the banner above the dais, a deep green field with a gold lion, its mane impossibly neat. Mainstream fact again. Dowries weren't just money. They could include ships, titles to land, rare manuscripts, or rights to collect certain taxes, all negotiated with excruciating detail before the marriage. Quirky tidbit again. Occasionally, a dowry would contain something odd but valuable to the other kingdom, like a breeding pair of exotic birds, or a monopoly on a rare spice. There's a record of one dowry that included the rights to fish in a specific river every third Sunday. Joke 2. You picture the diplomatic argument that must have broken out when someone accidentally fished on a Saturday. The hall smells now of roasting meat, honeyed wine, and faint wood smoke from the torches. You notice the subtle shift as people begin arranging themselves for the formal dance. It's not optional. Your husband extends a hand, his expression polished to match the gold filigree on his sleeve. You rise, feeling the weight of your skirts, the faint drag of embroidered hem across the floor. The musicians find their melody, a slow circling tune that leaves no space for missteps. As you turn beneath the carved beams of the hall, you catch sight of the noblewoman again, watching you over her goblet. It's not just a dance, it's a test, and you know it. Joke 3. You think about deliberately stepping on your husband's foot, just to see if the lion on the banner above will wince. When the music fades, applause flutters politely around the room, like the sound of parchment pages turning. And somewhere, hidden in those pages, is your place in this new story. The following morning, light slants through narrow leaded windows, catching in the motes of dust that drift lazily through the air. The palace is quieter at this hour, though the silence is deceptive. Somewhere in the warren of rooms and galleries, servants are already setting the stage for the day's pageantry. You are summoned, not to a formal audience or a council meeting, but to the Queen's own solar, where the first piece of intrigue will present itself in a deceptively beautiful package. On a low table, draped in a cloth of deep blue, sits a small wooden casket bound with silver hinges. A lady-in-waiting hovers at your elbow. "From the Duchess of the Western Marches," she says, and her mouth twitches, not a smile, exactly, more like the shadow of one. Mainstream fact. Exchanging gifts between noble households was a common diplomatic practice in medieval Europe, especially among women of rank. These offerings were not just tokens of goodwill, they could be subtle political gestures, symbolic statements, or even quiet tests of loyalty. Quirky tidbit: it wasn't unusual for recipients to keep such gifts sealed for weeks, or even months, waiting for the right, astrologically favorable day to open them. In some cases, the delay was purely strategic, meant to give the sender time to reveal, through gossip, what the gift was supposed to mean. Historians still argue whether these exchanges were primarily genuine personal courtesies or calculated tools of influence. The truth is likely tangled somewhere in between. The casket opens with a soft sigh of old wood, revealing a gleaming comb of ivory, its teeth carved with tiny intertwining vines and birds in mid-flight. It is exquisitely made, too exquisite perhaps. You run a finger along the smooth edge, wondering how many hands touched it before it reached yours. Joke 1. You imagine the Duchess's workshop where a craftsman asked, "Shall I make it friendly, or just unsettling enough to keep her guessing?" Your lady-in-waiting tilts her head. "A generous gift," she says, "unless one reads into the choice of birds." You look again. Each bird's wings curve toward another's, yet their beaks are just short of touching. A pause, frozen in carved time. Mainstream fact again. In some medieval courts, imagery on personal items like combs, brooches, or girdle books was chosen with great care, often carrying hidden meanings known only to the giver and the intended audience. Quirky tidbit again. There was a persistent belief that certain carved patterns could influence the wearer's fortune, or their relationships, by imprinting symbolic energy through daily use. It's difficult to prove, but medieval inventories sometimes note such details with a suspicious level of precision. Joke 2. You decide the safest thing might be to use the comb only on days when you're already in a good mood. As you set the comb down, you realize the gift's arrival has already rippled through the palace. Servants will whisper about it, courtiers will speculate on the Duchess's motives, and your reaction, whether gracious or guarded, will be measured by those who were nowhere near the solar. Through the open window, you hear the muffled sound of the castle's morning bustle, the clang of buckets in the courtyard, the creak of wagon wheels bringing bread from the bakehouse, the distant shout of a guard to a sleepy sentry. Life goes on, even in the midst of silent skirmishes. Joke 3. You briefly consider sending the Duchess a thank you note so vague it could apply to anything from a priceless jewel to a sack of onions. But instead, you close the casket, smile faintly, and say to your lady-in-waiting, "Please have it placed where it can be admired." In this court, that's the safest kind of answer, a move on the chessboard that's neither advance nor retreat. By mid-afternoon, the great hall is alive again, torches burning despite the daylight, long tables lined with polished pewter plates that catch glints of orange from the fire pits. You take your place near the high table, where the music is softer, the food a little richer, and the conversations a great deal sharper. Today's entertainment is not a play or a song, but something far more dangerous. The court whisperers at work. They drift in loose clusters, leaning toward each other in ways that appear casual but are calculated down to the inch. Words are traded like rare spices, measured, precious, and able to change the flavor of the entire room. Mainstream fact. In medieval courts, gossip wasn't just idle talk, it was a recognized instrument of influence. Chroniclers occasionally recorded how rumors shaped succession disputes or destroyed political careers, even without hard evidence. Quirky tidbit. Some courts even had unofficial masters of whispers, skilled in remembering every scrap of overheard conversation and delivering it, often with subtle embellishment, to those who could use it to their advantage. Historians still argue whether gossip at this level functioned as a kind of informal intelligence network, or simply reflected the human urge to embellish a good story. You sip spiced wine and watch the ripple effect. One lady pretends to adjust the clasp of her gown while another leans in, speaking behind her hand. Across the hall, a squire laughs too loudly at a joke, drawing the attention of 3 more bystanders, who will now have a new thread to pull later. Joke 1. You imagine these whisperers as rare birds, puffing their feathers to attract the next listener. It doesn't take long for you to catch fragments of your own name. You force your gaze to remain on the roasted capon before you, as though the conversation you're overhearing is about something as dull as weather. Mainstream fact again. Royal women were particularly susceptible to reputation-shaping gossip, partly because their public appearances were fewer and their private lives more closely scrutinized. Quirky tidbit again. In some courts, the spread of a flattering rumor could be purchased in the same way as fine cloth, given to one trusted voice and expected to trickle down to the rest, embroidered slightly with each telling. Joke 2. You wonder if you should start a harmless rumor about yourself, just to see how long it takes to come back to you wearing a completely different hat. As the feast moves toward its 3rd course, stewed pears and red wine, you notice one of your husband's advisors making his way down the hall, leaning in to greet people with the same smile he wears for both allies and enemies. When he finally reaches you, he bows, asks after your health, and makes a passing remark about a curious gift you received from the Duchess. There it is, the comb again, making its rounds. You respond with a vague compliment about craftsmanship, and he nods, clearly disappointed you didn't give him more to work with. Joke 3. You think about offering to lend him the comb, just to see what symbolism that might spark. The music swells briefly, and the whispers dissolve into new groups, threads of conversation tangling and looping back in unpredictable patterns. You take another sip of wine, tasting cloves and a hint of something floral, and remind yourself that in this court, your words are like arrows. They can travel farther than you intend, and you can't always predict where they'll land. The air in the hall grows warmer as the day wears on, the mingled sense of food, fire, and human presence settling into a heavy comfort. It's in this drowsy lull, when attention should be fixed on the platter of honeyed pastries being carried in, that the subtle drama of the dance begins. Not the lively kind with lutes and stomping feet. This is the quiet choreography of power. The steward approaches you with a shallow bow. "Your Majesty, would you honor us?" he asks, gesturing toward the cleared space in the center of the floor. You know refusing is not an option. This is the ceremonial waltz, slow, deliberate, each turn meant to display grace and unity between the king and his queen. Mainstream fact. In certain medieval courts, formal dances served as political theater, with every step and hand placement governed by unwritten rules. Watching nobles would interpret these movements for signs of harmony or tension between the royal couple. Quirky tidbit. Some courts had an unspoken rule that a dance's length matched the perceived stability of the realm. Short dances hinted at impatience or unrest, while drawn-out ones reassured observers of calm and control. Historians still argue whether these dances genuinely influenced public perception or simply reflected the court's appetite for symbolism. You step into the center beside your husband. His hand is cool and steady in yours, his expression one of polite concentration. The music begins, a slow air from 2 shawms and a bowed viol, their tones weaving through the murmurs of the crowd. Joke 1. You find yourself counting the beats not for timing, but to guess how many are left before your feet start plotting rebellion. The onlookers' faces hover at the edges of your vision, watchful, careful, pretending to be absorbed in the music. You notice the same older noblewoman from the day before, her eyes narrowed slightly, as though the angle of your turn could reveal state secrets. Mainstream fact again, clothing played its part too. Queens sometimes wore gowns stitched with specific colors or emblems during these dances, signaling alliances or political priorities without a single word spoken. Quirky tidbit again. There's a recorded instance of a queen wearing a gown patterned with pomegranates to signal fertility and abundance, only for the court gossip to twist it into a comment about her supposed fondness for foreign luxuries. Joke 2. You imagine showing up one evening in a gown embroidered entirely with turnips, just to see what the court makes of it. The dance stretches on. You pivot, glide, pivot again, the hem of your gown brushing the rushes with a whispery sound. Your husband murmurs something about the weather, which feels like the only safe topic in this silent battlefield. Joke 3. You wonder if, centuries from now, historians will debate whether that weather comment was a coded message to an ally. Finally, the music wins to its last note. The applause is restrained but sufficient, like the polite closing of a ledger. You retreat to your seat, heart steady but mind buzzing with the knowledge that even this simple waltz will be retold in the castle's shadowy corners, each version a little different from the last. The scandal doesn't arrive with trumpets. It arrives with a whisper from a page who looks like he's swallowed a tack. Your Majesty, he says, hovering in the doorway to your solar. The likeness in the long gallery is altered. You set down your embroidery, 3 polite pomegranates that will no doubt launch new rumors about your shopping habits, and follow him through a corridor that smells of beeswax and old oak.in the long gallery. Light pours through mullioned windows and makes a procession of rectangles across the floor. The portraits along the wall glow in their own slow way, past kings rendered with improbable cheekbones, saints with eyes like polished jet, and 2 hunting dogs that clearly enjoy better lighting than any human subject. Your place on the wall should be halfway down, opposite the tapestry with the stag and the cheerful hunters. Instead, there is a blank space, and a little farther along, a painting of you that is, not you. It is you in the broad strokes, the crown, the blue silk, the polite tilt of the head, but the face has drifted a few unflattering degrees toward cabbage. The mouth is meaner, the chin suddenly determined to lead all military campaigns, and the eyes look like they have been told a joke and did not find it improving. Someone has moved the official portrait and replaced it with a cousin who grew up on hard bread and grudges. Mainstream fact: dynastic courts used portraits as diplomatic tools, sometimes sending them ahead of royal brides or to distant allies as a kind of painted envoy. In an age before fast travel, likenesses were political currency, and a flattering image could smooth negotiations, or at least give everyone the illusion of harmony. You step closer. The paint on the substitute panel is thicker than it should be, the pigments a little chalky. The pearls along your neckline look like boiled peas. Your lady-in-waiting, the same one who politely decoded the birds on the Duchess's comb, inhales through her teeth. Workshop copy, she whispers. From the workshop that was told to hurry. Quirky tidbit: court painters sometimes kept patterned books, catalogs of noses, eyes, and hairlines, so assistants could assemble a passable likeness quickly. A good limner could compose a face like a recipe. A harried limner could compose a face like a stew, mostly correct, oddly seasoned, and better in dim light. The king's usher arrives at a near trot, sweating decorously. Your Majesty, the true portrait is safely stored, he says, which sounds less like reassurance and more like an alibi assembling itself. He explains that last night there was a draft, a wobble, a concern for smoke from torches, so the painting was moved to the steward's chamber. For its protection. A footman nods along as if drafts are known burglars with names and faces. Historians still argue whether such movings were housekeeping or maneuvering. whether portraits slipped around palaces out of genuine conservation worries or because factions wanted to boost, or bruise, a reputation by curating what walls remembered. Some see innocent caretaking, others see curatorship as politics by other means. You ask to see the original. The usher blanches but leads you to a small room where ledgers nap on shelves and a coal brazier ticks faintly as it cools. There, propped on a table between a stack of grain accounts and an inkwell big enough to drown a quill, is your missing likeness. And it is you, softened around the eyes, yes, but alert, steady, almost kind. The gold leaf haloing the brooch is laid so thin it shivers when the light moves. The court painter appears, materializing like a guilty conscience. He's spattered with vermilion and ultramarine, and his hands smell faintly of linseed and egg. "Majesty," he says, bowing low, "we felt the smoke might bloom the varnish." He gestures with long, paint-rough fingers. Also, the copy was requested for the feast, where spills are more conversational. Joke one lands softly. "Ah, yes," you say. "My face, now with improved wipeability." The painter's mouth twitches, then wisely resumes neutrality. He launches into a description of the materials. Gesso ground smooth on seasoned oak, egg tempera bound with a patient hand, glazes of lake pigment coaxed from the tears of crushed cochineal, and the long-suffering finances of the royal purse. He speaks about lapis lazuli as if it were a temperamental relative who must be invited to every wedding. Mainstream fact again, many medieval portraits on panel were painted in egg tempera, pigments bound with egg yolk, on a gessoed wooden support. Varnishes made from tree resins could darken over time, changing the face the world thought it knew. Later touch-ups sometimes produced the odd effect of a queen who appeared to age backward on Tuesdays. The steward fusses with the edge of the protective cloth. "We will restore the true portrait to the gallery this evening," he promises, which is the kind of sentence that means, "after 3 people argue about it, and 2 people take credit." You study the back of the panel. A small chalk mark, a circle with a bar, repeats near the braces. The painter notices. "Workshop mark," he says. "So if someone swaps it again, we can prove whose is whose." He hesitates, then adds, "Copies often travel. Safer to send a likeness with rough edges than a masterpiece that might never see home again." Quirky tidbit again. Some panels bore devotional miniatures on their reverse, a saint or a protective symbol, so that when the portrait was folded closed for travel, the back watched over the journey. A few even hid pockets for letters sealed under paper and wax. A painting could be a message twice over. You ask, quietly, who ordered the swap. The usher finds something fascinating on his own shoes. The steward studies the ceiling. The painter coughs into his sleeve and mutters about advice from above stairs, which is a very polite way of pointing a brush at the king's advisors without painting their names. Joke 2. You consider writing a small label to hang beneath the copy. After a long night, and see if anyone notices the humor before they notice the insubordination. A pair of clerks arrives to lift the true portrait back to the gallery. You follow, watching as they hang it with surprising tenderness, adjusting the wire so the frame sits level, tapping the nail once, twice, the sound like a gavel ending a silly trial. In its rightful place, your painted self looks out at the room as if nothing happened, composed, available to be read like a book everyone will annotate differently. Mainstream fact, tucked into the frame, portraits in royal spaces were not passive decoration. Placement mattered, opposite a Victory tapestry, beside a patron saint, near the door that envoys used. A painting's neighbors could change its meaning as surely as a caption. Servants pause to stare, then rush on, courtiers stroll by with the indifference of people who have been waiting to be seen ignoring something. Across the hall, the older noblewoman tilts her head, measuring the change. She offers you the briefest nod, a concession that today, at least, the wall agrees with you. Historians still argue whether accuracy mattered more than symbolism. Did courts crave a faithful likeness, or did they prefer a perfected idea? Some portraits are so idealized that the sitter could be anyone of the correct rank. Others carry the stubborn specificity of a mole or a crooked tooth that says, "Yes, it's me, and I was here." The painter, more relaxed now that Cabbage has been demoted, leans in. "If I may, Majesty, avoid the west windows at sunset. The light will make the varnish bloom, and gossip blooms with it." He offers a small pot of resin and a rag as if arming you for battle. Joke 3. You take the rag solemnly. "At last," you say, "a weapon I'm qualified to use." By evening, the gallery is itself again, dogs with their excellent lighting, saints with their patient gazes, kings with their improbable cheekbones, and you, somewhere between patience and policy. The copy is returned to the workshop to be improved, which is a generous verb for what it needs. The Duchess's comb still glints on your dressing table. The memory of last night's dance still clings to the hem of your gown like a rumor that refuses to go home. You pass the portrait once more on your way to supper. For a heartbeat, painted you seems to blink, which is only a trick of lamplight, but you accept the encouragement anyway. Portraits, like people, can be moved, retouched, and misread. The point is to keep returning to the wall and insisting gently on your own face. The corridors smell faintly of rosemary and damp wool after last night's rain, the scent clinging to the tapestries like a memory. This morning's summons comes not from the steward or the king but from the mistress of robes, a woman whose expression suggests she keeps a running ledger of every garment you own and every garment you ought to own. She meets you in the wardrobe chamber, a long, high-ceilinged room lined with carved chests and open presses where silks and velvets hang in orderly ranks. Light filters through narrow arrow-slit windows, turning the dust motes into floating pearls. On a trestle table in the center lies a gown you've never seen before, deep russet, embroidered with twining vines in a thread so green it seems to hold the memory of summer. Mainstream fact: in many medieval courts, clothing was both a personal choice and a political statement. Colors, fabrics, and patterns could indicate wealth, alliances, mourning, or triumph, and some sumptuary laws dictated exactly what certain ranks could and could not wear. Quirky tidbit: certain colors, like a particularly vivid shade of crimson, were so expensive to produce that they were often reserved for the monarch and a few high-ranking nobles. The dye came from rare sources, such as the Kermes insect or imported cochineal, making it more costly than gold thread by weight. Historians still argue whether queens had full control over their wardrobes or if courtiers and advisors heavily curated their attire to send the correct messages at public events. The mistress of robes circles the gown like a hawk measuring a rabbit. "This," she says, "arrived this morning. From His Grace's cousin?" Her tone makes it clear she's already calculated the political value of wearing it, and the potential risk if you don't. You touch the fabric. It's heavy, the pile of the velvet shifting under your fingers like fur. The embroidery vines end in tiny, gilt pomegranates no bigger than your thumb's nail. You wonder briefly if the pomegranate motif is now following you like a stray cat. Joke 1. At this rate, you suspect you'll end up with a nickname like Her Most Fruitful Majesty. And not in the way the court poets would intend. The mistress of robes lifts the gown to your shoulders, stepping back to judge the effect. "It will read well," she says. particularly beside the Queen of Navarre, who favors pale hues. Translation: you'll stand out, and not by accident. Mainstream fact again: public appearances at court were carefully staged. Standing beside or apart from certain figures in the hierarchy could signal alliances, rivalries, or subtle shifts in influence. Quirky tidbit again: some queens deliberately clashed with their rivals in clothing choice, not just in color but in cut or even the way their sleeves draped, to create visual tension that onlookers would gossip about for weeks. Joke 2. You imagine arriving at the feast in identical garb to the Queen of Navarre, then pretending you had no idea, while quietly enjoying the chaos. The mistress of robes produces a girdle belt of linked gold medallions. "Wear this," she says, "and you'll look more like a benefactress than a bride." You raise an eyebrow but allow her to fasten it. In the long glass, your reflection is transformed, the russet velvet rich as autumn, the vines curling with studied elegance, the pomegranates gleaming like captured suns. She warns you about posture, how the gown will hang best if you keep your shoulders just so, your chin angled to catch candlelight without creating shadows beneath your eyes. You nod, feeling more like a painting being adjusted than a person preparing for supper. Joke 3. You briefly consider standing completely still all evening, just to see if anyone mistakes you for a new portrait. As you leave the wardrobe chamber, the rustle of the gown follows you like a second presence. Every sound in the corridor, the echo of boots, the clink of distant goblets, feels sharper, as though the dress itself is listening. Somewhere down the hall, you hear the scrape of a chair and the faint pop of laughter. The court will see the gown tonight, and it will talk. By the time the evening feast begins, the hall is a lantern-lit sea of color. Candles drip steadily along the trestles, their light catching on silver dishes piled with sugared fruits and meat pies. The russet gown moves with you like it remembers every step before you take it, the vines glinting each time you pass beneath a torch. You take your place at the high table beside the king, and the first course is served, almond soup fragrant with cinnamon. Courtiers arrive in a slow, deliberate ripple, the hum of greetings swelling with each new arrival. Mainstream fact: feasts in the medieval period were as much about display as they were about nourishment. The order of seating, the timing of courses, and even the decorative subtleties between courses were all opportunities to communicate status, wealth, and political messages. Quirky tidbit: some subtleties, those sculpted sugar or pastry creations, were edible only in theory. Their main purpose was to be admired, then gossiped about, then left mostly untouched for the servants to nibble in the kitchens afterward. Historians still argue whether the grandeur of such events genuinely reinforced loyalty among nobles or whether it simply provided more fuel for jealousy and rivalries. The Queen of Navarre enters halfway through the soup course. She's wearing a gown of pale green, trimmed in silver fox, which indeed makes your russet seem richer by contrast. Her eyes flicker over you, one brow raising just enough to be seen across the table. Joke 1. You imagine holding up a placard reading, "Yes, I wore this on purpose," just to save her the trouble of wondering. The king engages her in polite talk, but you notice the ripple among the lower tables. Heads turn, glances are exchanged, and no doubt someone is already working out how to phrase this moment in the most entertaining way for tomorrow's gossip. Mainstream fact again: seating rivals near one another was a common tactic in medieval courts, allowing the monarch to keep watch over both while also signaling impartiality. Quirky tidbit again: in some cases, it was believed that sitting beside a political rival under the gaze of the court would ward off accusations of plotting, at least until the feast ended. Joke 2. You think of all the poison testers in the hall tonight and briefly wonder if they get hazard pay for the psychological stress. The next course arrives: roasted peacock, feathers artfully reattached so the bird appears in mid-strut, its iridescent train spilling like spilled jewels across the platter. Murmurs rise as people lean to admire it. Your knife hovers over the meat, but your mind is elsewhere, watching the subtle ballet of glances, tilts of the head, the small smiles that carry messages like folded notes. The Queen of Navarre compliments your embroidery, her tones sweet as almond milk. "A gift?" she asks. You match her smile. "From the king's cousin," you reply, leaving the space between the words just wide enough for her imagination to slip in. Joke 3. You imagine the court poet scribbling down the exchange, ready to produce a ballad entitled "Two Queens and a Velvet Vine." By week CND.AS musicians take their places by the wall, the feast slows. Servants refill goblets, the scent of spiced wine curling through the air. Across the hall, you catch sight of the older noblewoman again, nodding to herself as though your gown has confirmed something she already suspected. Whether it's an alliance or an advantage she's identified, you can't yet tell. The peacock is carved, the subtleties are admired, and the evening moves toward its final, quieter stages. Yet you can feel it, the gown has done its work. Tomorrow, the court will have new stories to tell, and you will be at the center of them, like it or not. Morning in the palace begins with the sound of shoe leather on stone and the subtle clink of metal on fabric, small, companionable noises that say people are fastening themselves into their roles. You're dressing in your chamber with the windows cracked just enough to let in the smell of wet cobbles and bread from the bakehouse. Your maid lifts a mantle of soft blue and, with the gravest ceremony, presents you with the brooch you've worn since your arrival. A round piece of gilded silver, chased with vines and set with a modest blue stone. It looks like calm you can pin to your shoulder. You feel the familiar weight as she fastens it through the layered fabric. "Steadier than a vow," she murmurs, one of those servant proverbs that sounds older than the wall itself. The day's first obligation is a short procession through the great court to a chapel service, all very mild and public, perfect for people who want to be seen not speaking to each other. Mainstream fact: brooches and badges weren't just decoration in medieval courts. Annular brooches, brooches, and livery badges could advertise rank, allegiance, or favor. In later medieval England, for instance, nobles distributed badges bearing their emblems to retainers. On the continent, jeweled brooches signaled dynastic claims, marriages, or mourning. A small pin could carry a very large message. The procession forms: ministers in white, squires in their best, ladies a little stiff from too much embroidery and too little breakfast. You walk with the Queen of Navarre on your right, which is either a coincidence or a joke the steward is telling through spatial arrangements. Her gown is pale again, the color of pear flesh, and her own brooch glints like a small sun where it catches the light, a gold disc with a hawthorn sprig in enamel. A courteous thorn, you think. At the chapel door, there is the usual little bottleneck of courtesy. Who yields, who steps, who turns a fraction too slowly and becomes a brief landmark. In that brief knot, the air smells of beeswax and damp stone. A lady behind you coughs, someone drops a prayer book with a soft thud, and a sleeve brushes your shoulder. The brooch's pin ticks once, an insect click, and then everything settles. Service is brief, the chant low and even, the kind of sound that lets thought drift without capsizing. Afterward, in the cloister, the talk resumes like a stream finding its bed again. You sip watered wine and say the harmless things one says. Pleasant weather for the hawks, the roses in the outer court are late, the kitchen's almond tarts have improved since Lent. Through it all, The brooch sits cool and steady. That's what you think, anyway, until your maid goes pale and whispers, "Majesty, your pin." You glance down and see an entirely different piece staring up at you from your mantle. Not vines in a tranquil blue, but a hawthorn sprig in enamel, nearly the twin of Navarre's badge, save for a tiny difference in the number of leaves. Your stomach does that funny little lift it does when a staircase ends one step sooner than your feet expected. Quirky tidbit. Courts sometimes used near-identical badges to indicate factional nuances. Same plant, different leaf count. Same saint, different gesture. To the untrained eye, nothing had changed. To insiders, the difference was as clear as if someone had rung a bell. There are inventories that read like riddles. 3 badges of the falcon, 1 with closed wing. Collectors today would kill for the footnotes. You look up to find the Queen of Navarre watching you with exquisite politeness, her own shoulder now carrying a circle of vines and a blue stone that looks very at home where it absolutely does not belong. For a beat, the cloister is perfectly peaceful, which is to say your heartbeat is the loudest thing in it. Then the smallest smile finds her mouth. "How obliging the air is," she says softly, "to move our ornaments where they will do the most good." Joke 1 arrives as your brain suggests the obvious. Switch them back, quietly now. Your body, however, is already drafting a speech about how delightful it is when fashion and diplomacy borrow each other's clothes. You step closer, close enough that the embroidery on her sleeve becomes a small landscape, and murmur, "It seems the breeze has a sense of humor." Her eyes, steady, friendly, entirely not simple, flick to the corners where whisperers roost. "Or a schedule," she replies. Mainstream fact again. The exchange of personal items, gloves, ribbons, and yes, brooches, could serve as a token of favor or a signal of alliance. In tournament culture, a lady's favor might ride on a knight's arm. In the quieter warfare of court, a borrowed pin could say, "For today I stand with you," or, "We share a story, and everyone should notice." Historians still argue whether most such exchanges were prearranged theater or genuine accidents that clever people then exploited. Some chronicles read like stage directions, others record spontaneous moments that snowballed into policy by afternoon. The truth likely lived in that narrow corridor where accident and opportunity shake hands. You and Navarre choose the narrowest of possible paths, either apology nor boast, simply the slow, deliberate unfastening of each other's pins, as ceremonious and careful as the binding of a book. Metal slides through cloth with that delicate resistance only good fabric has. Close enough to trade the brooches, you both smell of rosewater and very faintly of ink. You repin her hawthorn to her mantle. She settles your vine and blue back where it began. 2 motions for heartbeats, a whole day's gossip written in a quiet duet. Joke 2, you consider whispering. "We should do this every week and see if the courtiers develop migratory patterns." From the far arch, the older noblewoman, your unofficial barometer in human form, tilts her head as if a painter has moved a lamp. She nods to herself, the tiniest motion that says she has already filed, cross-referenced, and weaponized what she just saw. The steward materializes moments later, all relief and blandness. "A draft, was it?" he asks. "A very strategic one," you say. Quirky tidbit again. Some brooches house tiny compartments, relics, slivers, perfumed wax, a folded scrap of prayer, meant to sweeten the wearer's presence or protect against ill will. A few even carried minuscule notes, the writing so fine you needed young eyes or a magnifying lens to read it. If such a compartment exists in your own, you're not about to open it here. The cloister has ears. A young ambassador happens to pass through at that exact moment, bows, and produces a compliment that arrives wrapped in poetry and tied with a ribbon of mixed metaphors. The wreath of concord shines more fair when two queens share the sun, he declares. You admire the way he managed to say something and nothing simultaneously. Joke 3. You briefly picture a herald trying to paint that sentence on a banner and giving up halfway through for a nap. For the rest of the morning, the palace adjusts around your little weather event. In the buttery, two laundresses argue amiably about whether pins should have locks. In the stables, a groom announces to a horse that the wind has joined the Privy Council. In the long gallery, the court painter hears the story and contemplates sketching two identical brooches as a moral about light and perspective. Mainstream fact, folded into the hem of the day. Sumptuary expectations meant not everyone could wear every jewel. The right to certain stones and settings often tracked rank, and even when law was silent, custom barked loudly. By wearing, however briefly, each other's devices, you and Navarre created a harmless, reversible puzzle that let everyone practice being clever without needing new laws by sunset. Historians still argue whether these small, graceful puzzles did real political work or simply provided a safe outlet for tension. Perhaps both. A court is a human machine. It runs better when its gears can click without grinding. By noon the story has settled into its favorite version, a draft in the chapel, two queens laughing softly, the swift restoration of order, a parable about harmony if you like harmony, a parable about calculation if you prefer calculation. You are content to let it be both. It leaves you with a useful fact. The Queen of Navarre can play this quiet game at your tempo and with clean hands. That's more than you knew yesterday. You return the brooch to its box that night and find, tucked under the padded lid, a scrap of vellum you've never noticed, a small sketch of the same vine and blue, done years ago by a patient hand. On the back, in a fine, steady script, perhaps your mother's, perhaps a court scribe's, is a single line, hold where cloth is thickest. Good advice for pins. Better advice for reputations. You sleep with the window cracked, letting the wind do whatever it pleases out there among the whisperers. Inside, the brooch flies quiet, and so, for now, does the court. Dawn slips in under the door like an uninvited cat, pale and chilly. You wake to the quiet clink of pottery. Your maid has already brought a jug of warmed water for washing. She hums softly, the tune meandering the way only a servant confident in her place will risk. Today will not be a feast day, but the steward's note, left discreetly on your night table, makes it clear your presence is requested in the solar for a private audience. That usually means politics disguised as embroidery. You dress more simply than last night, a deep teal gown with narrow sleeves, soft wool lined with linen, comfortable enough for a long morning of sitting still. Around your neck you tie a modest silk scarf, its edges worn just enough to speak of long service. The air is sharp, you breathe it in like the first sip of wine, steadying yourself for whatever the solar holds. Mainstream fact, the solar in medieval castles was often a more intimate chamber than the Great Hall, a place where the lord's family could withdraw for warmth and quieter conversation. It was also, in many courts, the unofficial council chamber where small knots of influence formed and dissolved over needlework and chess. Quirky tidbit. Some solars were heated by braziers tucked into elaborate tiled alcoves, with perfumed herbs tossed onto the coals. Rosemary was popular, believed to clear the mind, lavender, to sweeten the air, and sometimes rue, which was thought to ward off both illness and bad luck, though it smelled strongly enough to drive off small talk as well. Historians still argue whether these intimate settings gave queens greater agency or merely offered a softer backdrop for the same political games played in the hall. When you arrive, 3 other women are already there. The Queen of Navarre, of course, in a gown the color of clouded cream. Lady Cecily, whose face is as unreadable as an unmarked coin. And the King's aunt, a formidable figure in charcoal gray, whose sharp eyes suggest she could untangle a tapestry not with one glance. They are bent over a frame of fine linen, each working on her square with the steady rhythm of practiced hands. You take your seat and thread a needle, the silk sliding between your fingers. Conversation begins with the safest of topics: a hawk's recent escape, the progress of the new orchard. Joke 1. You imagine the hawk reporting back to its kin about the baffling habit humans have of discussing fruit trees as if they were diplomats. The King's aunt turns the conversation like a page. I hear, she says mildly, that the chapel's draft had a peculiar effect yesterday. The Queen of Navarre's needle doesn't falter. Her eyes remain on her work. You smile, just enough. The wind is an ambitious creature, you reply. It likes to rearrange things. Mainstream fact again. Women in high-ranking medieval households often conducted diplomacy through such harmless talk, weaving in veiled references or subtle compliments. The needlework frame served as both occupation and plausible deniability. No one could accuse a lady of scheming when her hands were full of thread. Quirky tidbit again. Some embroideries hid small in-jokes or symbols in their patterns, invisible to all but the maker and intended recipient. A rosebud in a corner, a reverse stitch in a vine. These could serve as private signatures or even coded messages. Joke 2. You briefly consider stitching a tiny pomegranate into the corner of your square just to see if it sets off another round of speculation. The morning drifts on in this fashion, threads crossing linen, words crossing the air. Lady Cecily asks after your gown from the feast, her tone light but her eyes sharp. You give her the tailor's name, knowing full well she will send for something similar, and that the court will quietly note the imitation. The King's aunt shares a tale of a winter years ago, when snow drifted so high against the outer walls that they tunneled through it to reach the kitchens. It kept the food warm, oddly enough, she says, sipping her wine. Joke 3. You picture a row of noble women tunneling through snow with ladles, as though hunting wild game. By midday, the embroidery frame holds a mosaic of colors, pearls sewn like dewdrops, silks twined like summer stems. No one has spoken a single direct word of politics, yet you can feel the gentle rearrangement of positions around you, the shifting of unseen weights. You've given as much as you've taken, and that is the unspoken measure of survival here. When you leave the solar, the hallway is bright with noon light, the rushes underfoot giving off a faint, grassy scent. Somewhere a servant is laughing, the sound carrying like a bell. And though nothing has been decided outright, you know the morning has left its mark, as sure as a stitch in a seam, invisible from afar but holding everything together. The afternoon sun turns the palace courtyard into a sheet of pale gold, and the pigeons have claimed the warmest spots along the roofline like small, puffed-up sentinels. You step outside after a quick meal, stew of lentils and onions, bread still warm from the oven, and find the steward waiting by the covered walkway. He bows slightly, then gestures toward the smaller inner garden. A message has arrived, he says, but the sender prefers you read it among the orange trees. You follow him into the walled garden, where the air is cooler, shaded by a lattice of carved stone. The oranges are not yet ripe, their green skins glossy against the dark leaves. A fountain murmurs in the center, the water catching sunlight in brief flashes. The steward hands you a folded piece of parchment. its seal bearing an unfamiliar crest, 2 swans, necks crossed. Mainstream fact: personal seals in the medieval period were as vital as signatures are today. They could authenticate letters, seal legal documents, or act as symbols of identity. Even relatively minor nobles often had distinctive designs that could be recognized instantly by the politically attentive. Quirky tidbit: some seals included small rebuses or visual puns on the bearer's name. A fish for someone named Pike, a tree for someone named Ashford. These personal jokes were both a mark of cleverness and a subtle way to ensure the seal couldn't easily be forged. Historians still argue whether certain elaborate seals were more for practical security or for sheer display, a way to remind the recipient of the sender's tastes and resources before they even open the letter. You crack the wax with your thumbnail. Inside, the letter is short and written in a hand so neat it almost looks printed. An evening may be more fruitful than a season, if chosen well. Where the pomegranate again. No signature, no date, just the lingering scent of beeswax and lavender. Joke 1. You briefly wonder if the palace gardener is moonlighting as a cryptic poet. You refold the letter and tuck it into your sleeve. The steward watches your face with polite detachment, enough to make you suspect he already knows what's inside. "Shall I inform the tailor?" he asks, as though discussing nothing more consequential than tomorrow's weather. Mainstream fact again: servants in noble households were often the true conduits of information. Many were lifelong employees, serving multiple generations of the same family, and could quietly influence the flow of events simply by choosing when to speak and when to remain silent. Quirky tidbit again: some stewards kept mental maps of the household's politics, noting who was speaking to whom, which alliances were in bloom, and which required pruning. A misplaced garment or delayed message could sometimes serve as a subtle nudge toward one outcome or another. Joke 2. You imagine the steward keeping an actual gardener's log for the court. Lady Cecile in partial shade, Queen of Navarre thriving after recent rain. You walk the garden paths once, the sound of your steps mixing with the fountain's whisper. The orange blossoms give off a faint, almost ghostly sweetness. A bee hovers by your hand, then decides you're not worth the trouble. By the time you return to your chamber, your maid has already laid the russet gown across the bed. The pomegranate embroidery catches the light exactly as it did the night you first wore it. She pretends not to notice your raised eyebrow. "The steward thought it best to have it ready," she says. Joke 3. You consider wearing the gown with a plain wool apron, just to see if anyone at the feast survives the confusion. You spend the next hour reading in the window seat, the letter tucked beside you like an extra bookmark. The book, a collection of saints' lives, offers no clues about pomegranates or swans, though one saint does perform a miracle involving the unexpected appearance of fruit in winter. The court is full of small miracles like that, though most come with a bill attached. As the shadows lengthen, the sound of lutes and laughter begins to drift up from the lower hall. Somewhere in the palace, someone is already telling a story about the evening to come. Whether you are the main character or a supporting role, you'll find out soon enough. Twilight has a way of painting the palace in honey and ink, the last sun catching the gilded moldings while the corridors beyond fall into shadow. Your russet gown is heavier than you remember, the pomegranate embroidery a quiet, deliberate shout against the deep fabric. Your maid fusses with the fall of the sleeves, murmuring about symmetry, as if symmetry itself might decide the evening's outcome. The great hall is already buzzing when you enter. Torches flicker along the walls, casting small shadows that flit from one tapestry figure to the next, lions and saints, and, in one odd panel, a unicorn drinking from a gilded well. The tables are crowded, but the high table is curiously sparse. the king, the Queen of Navarre, 2 visiting envoys, and an empty seat clearly waiting for you. Mainstream fact: high tables and medieval banquets were arranged to make statements. Proximity to the monarch signaled favor, and an empty seat could be a calculated device, drawing attention to its eventual occupant and prompting speculation before they even arrived. Quirky tidbit: in some courts, the honor seat was occasionally left vacant for symbolic guests, like St. George at a victory feast, or for someone whose absence itself was meant to be a political message. Historians still argue whether these seating arrangements were primarily about etiquette or about theater. Most likely they were both, etiquette being the script, theater the performance. You take your seat, aware of eyes tracking the moment. The king greets you warmly, but you can feel Navarre's gaze as well, curious, maybe amused, maybe something sharper. Before long, the first course arrives, a platter of trout, garnished with lemons so artfully carved they resemble roses. Joke 1. You briefly consider complimenting the fish on its excellent table manners before remembering it's no longer in a position to appreciate them. The envoys, one from Aragon, the other from a city-state whose name everyone here pretends to pronounce correctly, begin a polite discussion about trade routes. You nod at the right moments, offering a comment about the quality of saffron in last year's shipments. Mainstream fact again: saffron was a luxury spice in medieval Europe, often worth its weight in gold. It flavored dishes, colored fabrics, and was even used medicinally for everything from digestion to melancholy. Quirky tidbit again: because of its high value, saffron was frequently adulterated, mixed with marigold petals or even strands of dyed onion skin to stretch it. Laws against such fraud existed, but enforcing them was another matter entirely. Joke 2. You imagine a medieval market inspector dramatically unrolling a scroll and accusing a spice merchant of crimes against flavor. The second course arrives, pigeon pies with crusts shaped like miniature fortresses. They smell of pepper and thyme. The king slices into his and asks after your embroidery, of all things. The pomegranate, he says, is a symbol of abundance, is it not? You answer with a carefully measured smile. And of unity, majesty, many seeds beneath one skin. Navarre's lips curve in a way that suggests she's just written that line down in her head, perhaps to use later. The envoys exchange glances, as if a private conversation has just been conducted over their heads. Mainstream fact once more: the pomegranate was indeed a symbol of fertility and unity in medieval iconography, appearing in both religious and secular art. It could represent the church, a kingdom, or a family, all bound together within a single form. Historians still argue whether such symbols were chosen for their beauty, their meaning, or simply because they were fashionable at the time. The musicians in the gallery strike up a softer tune as the hall shifts toward conversation and wine. The steward brings a small folded note to your plate, its seal, once again, the 2 swans. Inside, you are seen. That is enough for now. Joke 3. You picture the sender watching you from some hidden alcove, furiously scribbling. Stage 1 success. Onto a piece of parchment. You slip the note into your sleeve without comment. The rest of the meal passes in a pleasant haze of music, wine, and the subtle awareness that you have become part of a play whose script you haven't yet read in full. But you're learning your lines as you go, and for tonight, that seems to be enough. By the time the feast ends, the torches have burned low, and the air smells faintly of ash and cinnamon wine. You leave the great hall with the others, the murmur of conversation trailing into the corridors like a loosened ribbon. The Queen of Navarre drifts toward the musicians' gallery, ostensibly to compliment their playing. You, however, are steered, ever so gently, by the steward toward the long gallery that connects the residential wing to the old tower. The long gallery is nearly empty at this hour, lit by just a few oil lamps. Tapestries hang along the walls, their colors muted in the dimness. Hunting scenes, saints' processions, a depiction of some long ago siege where both sides seem to have far too many banners. The floor creaks softly beneath your shoes, a sound absorbed almost instantly by the rushes. Mainstream fact: long galleries in medieval and early modern palaces were multi-purpose spaces, used for exercise during bad weather, for displaying art, and for private conversations that needed to be conducted in motion. Walking together made it harder for eavesdroppers to catch more than a word or two. Quirky tidbit: some galleries had deliberate listening spots, alcoves or structural quirks where sound carried unusually well. Courtiers would loiter there, pretending to admire the weaving while catching snatches of conversation. Historians still argue whether these acoustic tricks were accidents of architecture or intentional features designed by builders who understood that information was as valuable as stone. Halfway along the gallery, a figure steps from a shadowed alcove. It's the envoy from Aragon, holding a small, cloth-wrapped parcel. From a friend, he says in a voice pitched just low enough not to carry. He offers it without ceremony, as though passing you a folded napkin. Joke 1. You half expect to unwrap it and find a pigeon pie, still warm. Instead, it's a carved box no larger than your palm, inlaid with a pattern of vines and tiny silver pomegranates. The clasp is worked into the shape of two swans with their necks entwined, so small you'd almost miss it. The envoy inclines his head. Best opened in your chamber, he says, and steps back into the shadow, leaving only the faint scent of clove. Mainstream fact again: miniature boxes like this were common in courts, used to hold everything from jewelry to medicinal herbs. Their decoration often mirrored the tastes or symbols of their owners, turning them into portable statements of allegiance or identity. Quirky tidbit again: some were designed with hidden compartments, sliding panels that could conceal a folded note or a small token. These required a practiced touch to open, ensuring only the intended recipient could access the secret. Joke 2. You imagine accidentally locking yourself out of such a compartment and having to ask the castle carpenter for help. Oh, nothing important inside, just the future of the realm. You continue down the gallery, the box now tucked into your sleeve. The hallways beyond are warmer, lit by the steady glow of hearths. Your maid meets you outside your chamber, eyes flicking briefly to the sleeve where the shape of the box must be visible. "Shall I prepare the brazier, my lady?" she asks, all innocence. Once inside, you bolt the door and set the box on the table by the window. The moonlight makes the silver pomegranates gleam faintly. You test the clasp, stubborn, but it yields with a click. Inside, nestled on a square of folded silk, is a single brooch, vines curling around a blue stone, identical to your own, except for the tiny hawthorn sprig engraved along the pin. Historians still argue whether such altered copies were meant as compliments, challenges, or subtle claims. The craftsmanship here suggests all three at once. Joke 3. You can't help thinking this is starting to feel like a very elaborate game of collect all the brooches that someone forgot to tell you the rules for. The moonlight shifts as a cloud passes, and for a moment the blue stone seems darker, deeper, almost like water at night. You set the brooch back in its silk bed, close the box, and slip it into the drawer beside your bed. There's no note, no instruction, just the unspoken understanding that, by receiving it, you've been moved one square further on whatever board is being played. You blow out the lamp, leaving only the moon to keep watch. Somewhere in the distance, the fountain in the orange garden murmurs on, oblivious to the fact that its quiet rhythm has now been woven into a story far beyond its walls. Morning arrives dressed in fog, softening the palace walls and making the towers look like they've stepped back a few centuries into their own memory. Your chamber is cool enough that you pull a shawl over your shoulders before rising. The carved box still rests in your drawer, and you catch yourself glancing at it as though it might have moved in the night. Your maid sets out a simple breakfast: bread, cheese, and a bowl of pomegranate seeds glistening like tiny rubies. You raise an eyebrow, but she only shrugs. "The kitchen's had extra," she says, her face the perfect mask of someone who knows exactly how many extra seeds were prepared. Mainstream fact: pomegranates were luxury fruits in much of medieval Europe, imported at considerable cost from warmer climates. They often appeared at royal tables as symbols of wealth and status, especially in winter when fresh fruit was scarce. Quirky tidbit: in some courts, the careful removal of pomegranate seeds was an art form. Servants were trained to extract the seeds without bruising them, arranging them in patterns on silver plates for presentation. Historians still argue whether such displays were meant more for the taste of the fruit or for the visual effect, a jeweled dish to impress guests. You take a spoonful, the juice bright and tart, and wonder if this is someone's way of reminding you that symbols are edible too. After breakfast, the steward appears at your door again, this time with an invitation. "A ride in the deer park," he says, "at the Queen's request." Joke 1. You half hope he means the other queen, if only for variety. But no, it's the Queen of Navarre waiting at the stables, dressed in a riding gown of deep forest green. Her palfrey stamps its hooves, breath curling in the cold air. She greets you warmly, almost too warmly, and hands you the reins of a chestnut mare. "I thought we might enjoy a little fresh air," she says, as if fresh air alone had summoned you here. Mainstream fact again: deer parks in medieval times were enclosed tracts of land where nobles kept herds for hunting or display. Access was tightly controlled, and riding through them could be both recreation and a display of privilege. Quirky tidbit again: some parks contain not only deer but exotic animals gifted from foreign rulers. Everything from peacocks to, in rare cases, lions, meant to dazzle visiting guests. Joke 2. You can't help imagining the court gossip if the queen had chosen to ride alongside a lion instead. The fog curls between the oaks and chestnuts, muffling the sound of the horse's hooves. Navarre keeps the pace slow, her conversation drifting from weather to fashion to, inevitably, politics. She mentions the Aragonese envoy in passing, her tone light, but the glance she gives you sharp enough to pierce chain mail. You deflect with a story about your embroidery, tossing in a detail about reverse stitches that makes her laugh. It's a pleasant sound, and for a moment you almost believe the ride is simply what it appears to be. Almost at a bend in the path, the mist thins enough to reveal a small pavilion by the water's edge. Inside, a table is set with mulled wine and honey cakes. Navarre dismounts gracefully and gestures for you to join her. Mainstream fact once more: mulled wine was a common treat in cold weather, often spiced with cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg, expensive imports that proclaimed the host's wealth as much as they warmed the drinker. Quirky tidbit once more: some recipes called for a slice of toast to be floated in the cup, a tradition that some say gave rise to the phrase, "to raise a toast." Joke 3. You consider tossing the toast into the lake just to see if the phrase would then mean something entirely different. The two of you drink in companionable silence for a while, the mist rolling past like slow-moving ghosts. Navarre sets her cup down and looks at you, her expression unreadable. "You've been busy," she says. It's not a question. You meet her gaze steadily. "So have you." Her smile returns, small but genuine. Perhaps we'll compare notes, in due time. And with that, she rises, the conversation closed but not finished. The ride back to the stables is quieter, though the air between you is warmer somehow. You part with polite farewells, but as you hand your reins to the stable boy, you realize the pomegranate embroidery has found another audience, one that may yet surprise you. The fog has burned off by noon, leaving the palace roof tiles bright as fish scales in the sun. You've just finished a quiet hour with accounts. Numbers are the only courtiers that never change their stories. When a page arrives, flushed with the kind of excitement that usually precedes mischief. "Your Majesty," he whispers, as though the words might bruise if spoken aloud. "There's a slipper." You allow yourself one heartbeat for confusion. Then the tide of recognition hits. Not just any shoe, a velvet slipper, the exact shade of ripe plum, discovered beneath the musicians' gallery after last night's feast and now sitting in the steward's hands like a captured rumor. Mainstream fact. Indoor footwear in late medieval courts ranged from soft leather-turned shoes to velvet slippers and, in some regions, pattens. Wooden or leather overshoes that protected fine soles from wet floors. Many turn shoes were made on straight lasts, meaning there was no left and right. The pair shaped to the wearer over time. You find the steward in the long gallery, shoe held in a clean cloth like a relic. He turns it so the light can comb gently across the nap, deep velvet, edge bound in silk braid, four tiny pearls stitched in a line on the vamp. The sole is thin but well made, the kind that glides across rushes without arguing. There's a faint perfume of lavender and something citrus, as if the wearer tucked a sachet into the toe. Quirky tidbit: some noble households perfume slippers with crushed herbs, lavender, marjoram, even a rub of orange peel, so that a curtsy or a turn in a dance would lift a breath of fragrance. A few inventories even list pomatus for shoes, tiny metal spheres half the size of a cherry, tied inside with ribbon to release a scent and allegedly repel miasmas. "This," the steward says blandly, which means, "This is extremely not bland, was discovered at dawn by the sweepers. No pair. No note." He tilts his head. "And no name stitched inside, which is either modesty or strategy." Joke 1 arrives uninvited. You imagine drafting a proclamation. "To all gentlewomen of sound foot and steady character, report to the gallery for orderly measurement," then filing it under, "Things we will never survive." The slipper is not yours. You know that instantly. Your indoor shoes are lined in pale blue silk. This one is lined in a warm cream. Your cordwainer's stitches run 8 to the thumb. This reads 9, neat as a monk's hand. But the court does not need facts, it needs a story. And already the air in the gallery feels charged, as if the tapestries themselves are leaning closer to listen. "Where was it exactly?" you ask. The steward nods toward the musician's dais. "Tucked under the edge, near the pillar with the stag carving. As though it slipped there by accident. Or perhaps by design." He says the last words like a man who would never accuse a shoe of plotting but is prepared to entertain the possibility. Historians still argue whether courtly, found objects, gloves, ribbons, or single shoes, were usually accidents turned into theater or carefully staged tokens meant to spark the very gossip they produced. Some chroniclers treat such moments as charming eruptions of chance. Others see them as one more instrument in the orchestra of managed appearances. You hold the slipper in your hand and do the foolish, obvious thing. You test it against your foot. It slides on halfway, then halts with the polite stubbornness of a cat refusing a bath. The steward makes the kind of cough that means he saw nothing. "Display it," you say at last. On the small table by the south window. Let it be found again, but tidily. The steward bows, and within an hour the slipper sits on a square of linen like a tame jewel, just where the sun will warm it into scent and the whisperers will have to pass by on their way to anywhere. Joke 2. You consider stationing a royal scribe beside it to take statements, then worry he will produce a manuscript titled On the Nature of Shoes and Sovereignty and dedicate it to you forever. The slipper does what good rumors do. It breeds. By mid-afternoon, the kitchen says it belongs to a lady from Aragon. Too much saffron on her hems, someone claims. The shoes smelled like oranges. The laundries swear it's Navarre's, too neat, too new, too deliberate. The stables argue for the minstrel's patron, the pearls. The way she laughed during the peacock course. A scullion whispers that it must be the Queen's because the color answers, your russet gown, which is embroidery logic but still logic. Mainstream fact again, color, answering, was a real thing. Courts paid attention to echoing motifs across garments and hangings. A queen's gown reflecting the room's tapestries, or a noble's sleeve matching the standard above the dais, could be read as harmony or allegiance. You decide to turn the temperature down before the kitchen starts staging foot-measuring comedies. Summoning the mistress of robes, you ask for a quiet fitting in the solar, just you, 2 ladies-in-waiting, and by invitation so pointed it wears a jeweled tip, the Queen of Navarre. The slipper is carried in on its linen square, and the solar becomes a small theater. You try it first, of course, and of course it refuses you with impeccable manners. Navarre lifts her skirt just enough to reveal a silk stocking the color of cream and, eyes glittering, slides her foot in. It fits, but the braid nips her instep. Too tight to be mine, she says lightly, and you recognize the careful generosity of the remark. She leaves room for the story to move without assigning it a walker. Lady Cecily tries next, close, but her toe meets the line of pearls with a thud like a punctuation mark. A younger lady, urged forward by curiosity and perhaps ambition, attempts it and squeaks when the heel snags. The room laughs softly, as if to locate the humor before it locates anyone's pride. Quirky tidbit again. Some shoes carried mottos hidden under the strap. Tiny embroidered words a wearer might memorize as a charm. One surviving example reads, in a hand so minute a sparrow could wear it, steadfast on smooth stone. You wonder what this slipper would say if you could peel back the silk and ask. Return it to the cordwainer, Navarre suggests at last, and have him whisper to us which last he used. A man who shapes feet for a living knows his customers better than most confessors. She smiles. Quietly, of course. You send a discreet boy to the workshop in the lane below the north wall. He returns near dusk with an answer wrapped in understatement. The slipper's last was carved for a lady of the household, either the greatest nor the smallest, with a foot that turns inward by a barley's breadth. A detail so precise it identifies no one, and yet somehow identifies everyone. Joke 3 strolls in when your maid mutters, we might weigh the courtiers by barleycorns next. And you imagine a solemn ceremony with scales and sacks marked policy. What to do with the thing? You opt for ritual. In the chapel's outer porch stands a modest, lost and found, shelf, brushes left by careless grooms, a rosary forgotten after vespers, a clasp that lost its cloak. You place the slipper there at vespers time, under the calm eye of a stone saint who has seen worse. The steward posts a simple notice. Let her who is missing a shoe reclaim it with a word to the mistress of robes. By morning, it is gone. No one mentions returning to claim it. No scribe records a confession. Yet the rumor does not end. It simply changes key. The slipper becomes a parable. About haste, about vanity, about the way a half-visible thing can outshine 100 careful appearances. In the kitchens, a new proverb hatches. Don't dance out of your shoes unless you can dance back into them. In the stables, tie your girth, find your pair. In the long gallery, the painter sketches a study of a foot in profile, then tears it up with a sigh, as if the angle of an arch might spill a state secret. You keep the days slow on purpose. Letters, a quiet hour in the herb garden, a glance at your portrait as you pass, still you, still steady. Symbols can exhaust people. They need space to air out. The slipper, having performed its part, is allowed to go on being a shoe somewhere else. Historians will later argue whether this was the moment when your court learned to enjoy harmless puzzles on purpose, to let a story flare and settle without demanding a culprit. Maybe it was. Or maybe everyone merely needed something gentler to talk about than treaties and dowries and the sharp corners of power. Either way, as dusk lowers its soft lid on the courtyards, you feel the palace breathe a fraction easier. You tuck your own slippers neatly by the bed, pleased with their determinately paired nature, and think, briefly, cheerfully, of ordering a set with pomegranate red braid just to taunt fate. Then you decide you've tempted enough metaphors for 1 week. Outside, a breeze stirs the rushes in the gallery. Inside, the lavender in your shoe chest keeps its quiet promises. You stretch your toes, listen to the hush of the night, and let the day's last image settle, a little velvet crescent under a window, bright as a gossiping moon, and harmless now that it has told its tale. The morning after the slipper's disappearance brings a different kind of intrigue, quieter, like the steady tick of water dripping into a cistern. Over breakfast, the steward approaches with an expression that hovers between amusement and warning. "A gift has been left in the East Loggia," he says, placing a wrapped bundle on the table beside your bread and cheese. The cloth is fine linen, tied with a thin strip of gold braid. You untie it to reveal a small illuminated page. Not a book, just a single leaf of vellum, its edges slightly uneven where it's been cut from a binding. The miniature shows 2 swans, necks twined, floating on a narrow river under an archway. In the background, a castle's pale walls rise into a sky the color of lapis. At the bottom, in fine Gothic script, a short verse: 2 paths meet in still water / each carries the other's reflection. Mainstream fact: miniatures like this could be devotional, romantic, or purely decorative. In some cases, a single page was gifted as a keepsake, often torn from a larger work that might have been copied just for the purpose of giving. Quirky tidbit: some courtiers collected single leaves rather than entire manuscripts, storing them in special boxes to be admired like playing cards. These could be traded, used as tokens in flirtations, or even stitched into clothing linings for luck. Historians still argue whether the removal of a page was an act of love, theft, or diplomacy. Sometimes it was all 3, depending on who told the story later. You set the page down carefully, conscious that the painted swans match the seal on the earlier notes. Someone is maintaining a theme, either as a signal or as a joke, and you're not yet sure which. Joke 1: you briefly consider leaving a response painted with ducks, just to see if they break character. Your maid peers over your shoulder, eyes narrowing. "That blue," she says, "is expensive. Crushed stone, not the plant dye." She's right. Lapis lazuli, imported from far to the east, costly enough that only the wealthiest patrons used it liberally. Whoever sent this is not merely resourceful, they're advertising it. Later in the morning, while you're walking the cloister, the Queen of Navarre falls into step beside you. She doesn't look at the page you've tucked under your arm, but you have the sense she knows exactly what it is. "I used to collect them," she says, idly trailing her fingers along the cold stone of the arcade. One from each place I visited. Pages remember things books can't. They smell of where they'd been kept. She glances at you then, just enough to suggest that she's not talking about vellum anymore. Mainstream fact again. Vellum can indeed absorb and hold sense from its environment, from incense in a chapel to the faint tang of sea salt stored near the coast. Quirky tidbit again. In one notorious case, a vellum charter was supposedly scented with rosemary to discourage moths. But the fragrance lingered so strongly that later readers believed it had been blessed with holy herbs. Joke 2, you. Imagine a medieval scribe having to explain that no, the page doesn't contain divine wisdom. It just sat next to the spice cupboard for too long. The conversation with Navarre drifts to other matters, but her presence lingers like the lapis in the miniature sky. By midday, you decide the safest course is to place the page somewhere it can be admired without being pocketed. The Solar's desk, under the steady gaze of a carved Madonna, seems the best choice. That afternoon, a different visitor arrives, the Aragonese envoy, as smooth as if the flagstones themselves had invited him in. He glances at the miniature, allows a faint smile, and says, "A fine hand. From Valencia, perhaps? They have a gift for swans." Historians still argue whether such comments are meant to share knowledge or to stake a claim. In this case, you suspect both. He leaves without further reference. But you notice the faintest trace of citrus lingering in the air after he's gone. Joke 3. You half wonder if everyone in this palace has decided to communicate solely through small, mysterious objects, and the occasional fruit-based fragrance. As dusk falls, you take one last look at the miniature before shuttering the windows. The swans seem to glow in the candlelight, their mirrored necks forming a shape that is not quite a heart, and not quite a question mark. The verse beneath them reads differently now, less a gentle observation, more an invitation. You slip the page into a folio with your own correspondence, careful to press it flat. Whatever game is being played, you intend to keep your pieces in order. Outside, the corridor is quiet, the air cools, and somewhere unseen, the fountain in the orange garden begins its soft night song again. The next morning breaks under a pale winter sun, the kind that glitters on frost but gives no real warmth. You wake to the sound of bells from the palace chapel, their notes drifting through the half-opened shutters like a polite summons. Your maid is already at the hearth, coaxing a fire from last night's embers. On the table, beside your usual bread and honey, lies something unexpected, a folded scrap of parchment, sealed not with wax but with a thin ribbon of green silk. You slide the ribbon free and unfold the note. The handwriting is careful, almost ornamental, each letter looped as though drawn with the tip of a small brush. It reads simply, "When the moon is high, walk where the oranges sleep." Mainstream fact. In many medieval palaces influenced by Islamic and Mediterranean design, orange trees were grown in enclosed gardens or courtyards, prized as much for their scent and evergreen leaves as for their fruit. Quirky tidbit. Some gardeners planted sweet-smelling herbs like thyme or basil near the roots to discourage pests, creating layered scents that would change subtly between day and night. Historians still argue whether night gardens were designed for romance, diplomacy, or simply because cooler temperatures kept the blossoms fresher. You read the line twice more. It's not a demand, not even a direct invitation, just a breadcrumb in the snow. Joke 1. You consider replying, "When the moon is high, I'll be in bed," just to see if your correspondent has a sense of humor. The day passes in slow ripples, council discussions about tariffs, a petition from the Bakers' Guild, a brief tour of the armory where you manage to nick your sleeve on a halberd hook. By the time dusk settles, The note is still folded in your pocket, as though its presence might influence the taste of the evening meal. After supper, you retreat to your chamber. Your maid lingers, clearly curious, but you send her to her own rest with an easy excuse about needing to work on correspondence. By the time the palace grows quiet, you are already wrapping yourself in a warm cloak, the note tucked in your glove. The orange garden lies through the southern cloister, a place you've visited often in daylight but never after dark. Tonight, the moon is almost full, pale and high, washing the walls in silver. The air is still, but the scent of the trees is stronger than ever, green, bright, with that faint undercurrent of spice from the thyme at their roots. Mainstream fact again. Medieval gardeners sometimes placed stone benches under fruiting trees so that visitors could sit and enjoy both the fragrance and the shade. In some palaces, these benches were carved with verses or blessings. Quirky tidbit again. There are records of orange trees in pots being moved indoors for noblewomen to enjoy in winter, complete with specially built carts to wheel them from hall to hall. Joke 2. You imagine a troop of servants trundling an orange tree into the great hall during a feast, only for someone to hang their cloak on it by mistake. You walk slowly between the rows, the moonlight laying soft shadows across the gravel paths. Near the fountain at the center, you see movement, a figure, cloaked, seated on one of the stone benches. You can't tell if they've been waiting long, or if they arrived only moments before. As you draw closer, they stand, and the hood tips back just enough for you to see the Queen of Navarre. Her face is calm, but her eyes catch the moonlight. "I thought you might come," she says, as if your appearance was never in doubt. Historians still argue whether moonlit meetings in gardens were truly private. Walls have ears, and gardens have gardeners. But the air here feels sealed. The only witnesses the orange blossoms and the steady trickle of water from the fountain. She gestures to the bench. Between you, on the stone, is a small silver dish. Inside, pomegranate seeds, glistening in the moonlight like a trail of tiny lanterns. She plucks one, rolls it between her fingers, and says, "Do you know why they're served at endings?" You shake your head. "Because they promise beginnings," she replies, then pops the seed into her mouth. Joke 3. You resist the urge to point out that they also promise stained fingers and ruined tablecloths. You each eat a few seeds, the tart sweetness lingering as she speaks in quiet, measured phrases about alliances, about the slipper, about swans and carved boxes and the dangers of letting others write your part in a story. By the time the dish is empty, you feel as though you've been offered, not a choice exactly, but a place in a pattern you can't yet fully see. When you finally stand, the moon has shifted, throwing the fountain into deeper shadow. Navarre pulls her hood up again, gives you a nod that feels like a seal pressed into wax, and disappears along the path toward the cloister. You remain for a moment longer, listening to the water and the faint rustle of leaves. Then you turn back toward the palace, the scent of oranges following you all the way to your door. Word travels strangely fast when it involves something small and fluffy. Before you've finished your morning bread, the palace has already decided that a crisis has occurred. Not a treaty, not a harvest failure, no, something more combustible. The king's aunt's lapdog is missing. The animal answers sometimes to the name Button, which tells you much about both dog and owner. A page arrives breathless, bowing so low he nearly addresses your shoes. Her Grace requests. He begins, then corrects himself under the weight of his own terror. Her Grace requires your presence. Which is how you find yourself in the aunt's solar. A room that could be an altar to orderly living. Cushions in disciplined rows, a brazier burning rosemary, a small basket of bone needles aligned like soldiers. And one empty cushion by the fire, edged with a braid of gold thread and very clearly meant for Button. Mainstream fact: tiny companion dogs were prized in medieval and later courts. Painters tucked them into portraits of noblewomen not just as decoration but as symbols. Dogs meant fidelity, fides, and affectionate loyalty. Breeding for diminutive size is attested in records of little spaniels and comfort dogs, often traded as diplomatic gifts alongside hawks and cloth of gold. The ant, severe even at her kindest, presses a handkerchief to her lips as if words might escape without permission. "He was here at Madden's," she says, indicating the cushion as though it has personally betrayed her. "By Prime, he was absent." She looks at you with the expectation of someone who believes queens collect small dogs from thin air. Joke 1 arrives like a nervous curtsy. You consider asking whether Button left a forwarding address, and decide instead to say, "We'll find him." The steward is present, which means the situation is both official and delicate. He lists the facts: no sign in the gallery, no yapping in the kitchens, which is an event in itself, no small dog-shaped disturbance among the embroiderers. The laundresses report nothing except a faint increase in the number of people popping by the warm drying room to make sure the linens are safe. Translation: the gossip current is at flood stage. Quirky tidbit: some ladies kept their toy spaniels tucked inside wide sleeves, sleeve dogs, to warm the hands and, it was said, the heart. Others set tiny bells on collars so the bobbing music of a pet announced a grand entrance 3 seconds early. Button's collar, you are told, has 4 bells and an engraved tag the size of a thumbnail. The bells, today, are silent. You ask to see the dog's cushion. It smells faintly of lavender and roast chicken. Button apparently enjoys both piety and lunch. There is a single pale hair clinging to the braid. Your maid ventures. The laundry court sees all, in the tone of one recommending a physician. You nod. If the palace has eyes, they are usually washing something. I in the laundry yard. Steam rises and polite ghosts from the cauldrons. A woman you've spoken with before, broad-shouldered, with the serene face of someone who has negotiated peace between wet sheets and winter winds, greets you with a nod. "We heard about the little lord," she says, hands never pausing at the ringer. "If he came past here, we'd have noticed. All small things visit us eventually." She points with her chin to a line where a pair of gloves drip like disciplined bats. Historians still argue whether lapdogs had practical uses beyond companionship. There's a persistent claim that they drew fleas off their owners, a theory supported more by anecdote and satire than by veterinary science. Others suggest their function was moral as much as physical, an emblem reminding sitters and viewers of the ideal virtues attached to their station. You ask if any unusual traffic passed since Prime. The laundress exchanges a look with her team. "A girl from the Falcon Mews came for hot water," she offers. "And a cordwainer's boy asked to warm his hands?" She shrugs. "And half the court stuck their noses in by accident to be near the boilers. Easy warmth makes honest liars." Joke 2. You imagine issuing a decree: no warmth shall be enjoyed without a reason written in triplicate, and hear the boilers laugh. Leaving the yard, you notice 2 small marks in the thin snow along the cloister edge, clean little crescents, twin punctures. Not quite cat, not quite rat. Your maid crouches, touches the print, and grins. Take 2 steps. Hear the tinkle? At the far end of the covered walk, you do. A faint bell, then silence. It comes again, a tentative silver stitch in the air. You follow the sound to the side chapel where votive lamps give the walls a friendly glow. Button is there, of course. ensconced on a folded vestment like a prince who has discovered a new country. He blinks at you with the unrepentant calm only the very small and very adored can summon. Around his neck, the famous collar, bells dull with dust, and this is new, a narrow ribbon tied in an extra bow, green as spring. Attached to it, a sliver of parchment. Mainstream fact again, messages on animals are not only the stuff of romances. Falconers used jesses with tiny notes. Pigeons carried writs in later centuries. Even horses bore stitched symbols identifying their riders. A lapdog courier is ridiculous, yes, and also entirely in keeping with a court that communicates in objects. You slip the parchment free. In a tidy hand you're beginning to recognize a friendly ransom, 1 hour's stroll in the Rose Court at noon tomorrow. Bring the blue brooch. Leave the slipper in peace. You look at Button, who yawns in a way that suggests he is both above and beyond politics. Joke 3, you whisper. Co-conspirator? Button sneezes, which you decide is an affirmative under the circumstances. Back in the ant's solar, relief detonates like a polite firework. She scoops the dog up, scolds him with 20 endearments, and vows to reassign 2 guards to his person. Button accepts the plan by falling asleep mid-lecture. The collar's added ribbon you pocket without ceremony. The ant sees, assesses, and chooses to ignore, for now. Historians still argue whether this sort of theft should be counted as crime, prank, or courtship ritual. Contemporary letters sometimes report such incidents with a wink. The Countess's white creature absented itself and returned trailing green, which tells you that everyone understood the grammar of these gestures even when they denied speaking the language. You send for the steward and the Queen of Navarre. They arrive within minutes. The court is a house with thin walls when it wants to be. You place the ribbon and note on the table. Navarre reads, then looks up, amusement flickering. Rose Court at noon? In January? Our correspondent has a sense of humor, and a good mantle. The steward clears his throat. Shall we post watchers? You shake your head. People speak more usefully when they think they're writing the scene. You will go, of course. The blue brooch will catch the winter sun and say, as calmly as a painted swan, that you can play this game in daylight. Before noon the next day, you walk the Rose Court, bare canes, neat ties, a dusting of frost that turns thorns into glass. You wear the blue stone brooch with its small hawthorns scratched along the pin, the one that arrived in the carved box. No one is there at first. Then, from the arch, comes the falconer's girl, cheeks red, hands tucked in her sleeves. She stops a respectful distance away and nods at your shoulder, as though greeting a person. The bird room thanks you, she says, meaning the muse acknowledges your discretion. We were asked to tie a ribbon to a noisy little courtier and point him at the warmest room. She grins. Hardest part was catching him. She glances once to the gallery where shadows move, listeners pretending to be statues. From those who sent the swans, she adds softly, eyes flicking to the brooch. They thought this would make you smile rather than frown. It does, inconveniently. You tell her to thank the bird room for their aeronautical services. She bows, produces a tiny sprig of dried hawthorn from her sleeve, and tucks it into a crack in the rose trellis as if planting a flag. Then she's gone, boots crisp on frost. You stand a moment longer, breath making small clouds, brooch cool against your shoulder. The court, which loves its little storms, has been given sunshine in winter instead. Button, restored to his cushion, is snoring. The ant drinks rosemary tea as if it were victory. And you, walking back through the cloister, understand something new. The invisible thread between jest and negotiation is stronger, and kinder than many treaties. By the time the bells mark none, the story has already found its best version. The brave rescue of a small dog from spiritual retreat, a green ribbon that tied the day into a bow, and a queen who walked the rose court at noon because someone asked her to with sufficient charm. The blue brooch catches the last light as you pass the long gallery, a quick flash like a wink from a friendly conspirator. The palace settles. Somewhere a painter sketches a sleeping dog. Somewhere a laundress tells the tale better than any scribe. Somewhere the swan-sealed correspondent sharpens a quill with an air of satisfaction. You close your door on a day that refused to be serious and accomplished more for that refusal. The next day dawns with a thin mist over the gardens, the kind that seems to soften every edge and muffle even the clatter of the kitchen yard. You wake to the sound of your maid bustling in with a tray, porridge, honey, and a folded scrap of parchment tucked beneath the spoon. This one is sealed with wax, deep crimson, stamped with a signet you haven't yet seen, a stylized pomegranate split to reveal its seeds. You break the seal. Inside, the message is brief. This afternoon, the long gallery. Wear something with gold thread. No signature. No explanation. Mainstream fact. In medieval courts, the long gallery was more than an architectural flourish. These extended, enclosed hallways served as spaces for walking in poor weather, displaying portraits and trophies, and conducting private, or semi-private, conversations under the cover of public leisure. Quirky tidbit: some galleries were designed with trick acoustics. Whispers in certain spots could carry unnervingly far, while conversations a few paces away would be swallowed entirely. Architects claimed it was unintentional, but chroniclers suspected otherwise. Historians still argue whether these galleries were primarily meant for display, diplomacy, or discreet intrigue. Joke 1. You briefly imagine showing up in a gold-threaded blanket just to test how literally the message was meant. By the appointed hour, you're in your chosen gown, a deep teal with embroidery in fine gold along the hem and cuffs. The gallery is bathed in pale winter light from tall windows on one side. The opposite wall is hung with a sequence of tapestries telling the story of Alexander the Great in stages both noble and implausible. A few courtiers stroll the length, pretending interest in the weaving while keeping an eye on each other. At the far end, beneath a tapestry of Alexander taming the Bucephalus, the Queen of Navarre stands with her hands clasped. She gestures you closer, her smile faint but genuine. "You've been given a pomegranate seal," she says without preamble. "That means you're being invited into the orchard." Mainstream fact again. In courtly symbolism, orchard could mean an inner circle, a shared confidence, or a literal enclosed garden. The metaphor worked particularly well in cultures where fruit trees were signs of cultivated wealth and control over nature. Quirky tidbit again. There's an obscure Provençal romance in which lovers communicate entirely by sending different fruits, each carrying a coded message, the equivalent of an edible cipher. Joke 2, you remark. "Hopefully not cabbages. They're harder to read and terrible in winter." Navarre almost laughs. She walks with you toward the center of the gallery, speaking softly enough that her words vanish into the drape of her hood. "The pomegranate seal belongs to someone who has influence without title, a patron of certain projects. They have been watching how you navigate the smaller storms here. The dog, the swans, even the slipper." Her tone makes it sound as though you've passed a series of practical examinations without knowing the questions in advance. Historians still argue whether this kind of gradual testing was deliberate grooming for greater roles or simply the natural filtration of court life. Those who adapted survived, and survival looked suspiciously like skill. The two of you pause before a tapestry showing Alexander's siege of Tyre, the sea stitched in improbable gold and silver threads. Navarre rests her hand briefly on your sleeve. When the invitation comes, it will not look like an invitation. You may have to answer before you're certain of the question. Joke 3, you murmur. Sounds like my first dance lesson. And she actually smiles this time. Before you can respond further, another figure approaches. The Aragonese envoy, his cloak lined in something that catches the light like frost. He greets you both, eyes flicking to the gold in your gown, and says, "The seal suits you." Then, almost as an afterthought, "There will be music in the West Loggia at dusk." Navarre inclines her head as though noting a coincidence, though you doubt she believes in them. "Enjoy the gallery," she says quietly to you before turning away, her pace unhurried, her attention already elsewhere. You walk the length once more, aware of how many eyes register your gown, the gold thread, the envoy's brief pause. Outside the high windows, the mist is lifting, revealing the orchard beyond the outer wall, bare branches now, but you can imagine it in blossom. Back in your chamber, you find another small package waiting. This time, it's a tiny gilded pomegranate carved from wood, no larger than a plum, its halves fitted together so perfectly that the seam is almost invisible. When you twist it open, there's a folded slip of parchment inside. West Loggia. Dusk. Wear the brooch. The blue brooch lies in its box on your desk, the stone catching the late light. You realize you've begun to look forward to these instructions, absurd as they sometimes are. The palace is still the same, cold corridors, whispered bargains, but you have started to feel less like a piece on the board and more like a player. As the hour approaches, you fasten the brooch, wrap yourself in a cloak lined with fur, and head toward the West Loggia. The sun is dropping, painting the sky in long bands of apricot and lavender. A small group of musicians is tuning their instruments, the sound thin but sweet in the open air. Beyond the rail, the view drops to the frozen river. The envoy is there, speaking with a hooded figure whose identity the light refuses to give away. When they notice you, the hooded one inclines their head, then slips away into the shadows of the arcade. The envoy approaches. "You have the brooch. Good. Keep it." He glances toward the musicians as they begin a slow pavane. "When the orchard blooms, you'll understand." You don't ask what that means, partly because you suspect it's not meant to be explained, partly because the music is lovely and the moment feels suspended in gold light. You stand at the rail until the sun is gone and the river is only a pale thread in the dark. The brooch feels warm against your shoulder, as though it's been holding the last of the day. Somewhere behind you, the envoy's footsteps fade, and the music slows into silence. The following morning, the frost lies heavier than usual, clinging to every branch and cobblestone like powdered glass. You wake before the bells, listening to the muffled quiet of the palace, a rare hour when even gossip seems to sleep. On the table by your bed, a single pomegranate seed rests on a folded scrap of parchment. The note is almost nothing, the orchard. Noon. Mainstream fact. Palace orchards were often enclosed with high walls, both to protect valuable fruit trees and to create a sheltered microclimate. In winter, they stood bare and still, but even then they served as spaces for privacy, an outdoor room hidden from the wider world. Quirky tidbit. Some orchards were planted with espalier trees, their branches trained flat against walls to soak up reflected heat. This gave the fruit an early ripening and made the trees themselves look like strange, leafless candelabra in winter. Historians still argue whether such enclosed gardens were primarily for pleasure, status display, or coded political gatherings. Joke 1. You consider showing up with a basket and asking where the fruit is. 18 noon. The orchard is all sharp sunlight and crisp air. The ground crunches under your boots as you step through the wooden gate. In the center, near a weathered bench, stands the Queen of Navarre. She holds a small packet wrapped in pale cloth and tied with gold thread. "You've played well," she says without ceremony. "You've kept your footing where others might have slipped." She presses the packet into your hands. "Consider this a keepsake from the orchard, though it will serve you better in the long gallery." Mainstream fact again. Gifts in cloth packets were common in court life, often holding spices, jewelry, or small documents. The wrapping itself could be a message, gold thread signifying honor, or a particular knot hinting at the giver's intent. Quirky tidbit again. In some courts, it was said that a packet tied with 3 knots could not be opened without breaking at least one promise. Joke 2. You're tempted to ask how many promises this one contains and whether they're refundable. You untie the thread carefully. Inside is the blue brooch, but altered. The stone is the same, but the setting now bears a tiny gold pomegranate, so small it would be missed by anyone not looking for it. Navarre watches you notice. Now you're part of the conversation. Wear it when you wish to be heard without speaking. Historians still argue whether such tokens were genuinely functional signals or simply the trappings of exclusivity. But in the moment, the answer doesn't matter. You feel the weight of it in your palm, warm from the sunlight, cool in the shadow of your fingers. Joke 3, you murmur. "And if I wish to be ignored?" Navarre smiles faintly. "Then leave it in its box and stay by the fire." You walk back to the palace through the cloister, the gold thread wound once around your wrist. The bells ring none as you enter the long gallery. A few courtiers glance up, their eyes sliding to the brooch and away again. Messages pass faster without words. That night, in your chamber, you set the brooch on the table beside the ribbon from Button's collar, the hawthorn sprig, and the carved swan. They look like trinkets to anyone else. To you, they are a map, one you've walked without knowing the roads, and one you will now follow with deliberate steps. The palace grows quieter as the candles burn low. In the corridors, the last of the servants pad softly, their voices no more than a murmur, their footsteps blending into the hush. Outside your window, the orchard lies silvered in moonlight, every branch etched in frost, the high walls standing like silent sentries. You sit by the hearth, the brooch in your hand, its blue stone deepened by the flicker of the fire. Each breath you take feels slower, more deliberate, as though the air itself has learned the pace of the evening. Somewhere in the distance, a lute plays a slow, unhurried air, the notes drifting upward like threads of smoke. You picture them weaving into the beams overhead, lingering in the rafters until morning. The warmth of the fire settles into your limbs, a gentle heaviness. Your thoughts turn over the day's moments like smooth stones, the frost underfoot, the weight of the packet in your palm, the way Navarre's eyes caught the light when she said you'd played well. Outside, the orchard will keep its quiet through the night. The gold-threaded packet is unwrapped now, but the thread itself lies coiled neatly on the table, a small loop of promise. Your breathing matches the slow rhythm of the ember's glow. The edges of the room blur a little, as though the air has softened, and even the ticking of the clock on the mantel seems more patient, each second stretching a fraction longer. The palace is at rest, the games of the day folded away like garments in cedar. You close your eyes, the blue stone cooling in your hand, and let the hush of the orchard follow you into sleep.